Welcome to Climate Quickies, bite-sized nuggets of climate goodness from our TEDx London experts in under 10 minutes.
In this week's Climate Curious, we're getting poetic, with a self-proclaimed environmental scientist in the streets and a poet in the sheets, that is, notebook sheets, Riley Faulds. Inviting us into the world of life writing, Riley's love for creative writing on the topic of nature was inspired by his upbringing on the west coast of Australia. Let's head over to Riley now to get a glimpse into his writing process and learn how to pick up a pen and get inspired to start your own life writing practices too. Stay curious!
Life writing is any form of writing, any literary genre that is about people's lives. And so memoir, biography, autobiography, autofiction, and forms of poetry that are about a person's life or some aspect of that comes under the umbrella of life writing. And yeah, there are many different forms of it, and my particular interest is in experimental life writing and life writing of the environment, and thinking about particularly that first word, life, and what can we allow that to encapsulate beyond the human as well. I write poems about non-human life worlds and experience, thinking about what it's like to be something that's non-human, even non-living, thinking about ecology through poetry, and what specifically the forms and styles of poetry specifically allows for the way that we think about the environment, for shifting some of the really dominant ways that we think about it, particularly in the West, and being able to kind of break up our language for it and find new ways to think and then therefore act when it comes to climate, when it comes to all kinds of environment-inflected issues and moments. There is a lot of value to the kinds of writing, narratives, poetry that centre the human, that are very unashamedly about a person's experience with the environment, with nature. There's a lot of nature writing, particularly in this country, that's along those lines. People who have a fixation, a fascination with, could be wild places, like Robert Macfarlane's book Wild Places, or Helen Macdonald's H is for Hawk, or classic J.A. Baker's The Peregrine. These are some kind of really canonic works of nature writing, which on different levels of the spectrum of being about their own experience of nature, and then on the other hand thinking about how to kind of distance their perspective and center the perspectives of, say, the peregrine falcon, and trying to reach towards what it would be like to be a falcon, what that experience is like, which is the core problem with the way that we think about nature. One of the core problems, there's plenty of problems. In the West, we have this Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment idea that there's a dualism. There's human and there's non-human. Those things are completely separate. The mind is separate from nature, and that's the way it is. When in reality, so many other different ways of thinking about the world, indigenous epistemologies and ontologies of ways of being, that we're just one part of these incredibly complex, diverse and interesting ecologies. And the way to think about that is not to center the human. It's to push yourself to one side and be thinking, actually, how are we part of this kind of complex network? And that's a really hard thing to do, because language is an inherently human tool, and to use language to do these things, you're going to be coming up against cultural ways of thinking about these things that are really deeply embedded. And also, to break away from those, how do you do that without using the word I or he or she or they? Or how do you think about what it's like to be moss in a way that's going to decenter the human in a useful way? And life writing in particular is kind of the anthropocentric genre, the absolute, most human-centered genre it has to be. But I think there's so much capacity within it. If that's the center of a problematic way of thinking, then that's a place where you can start that will have quite a lot of impact in terms of rejigging those things. It's a real privilege to be able to write some of the kinds of poetry I write, which is, how do I represent this really beautiful and interesting and complex landscape by sitting outside for 2 hours and looking at the sky, I've been back reading a lot of Australian poetry. A couple of First Nations poets in Australia who are just some of the most exciting, beautiful writers, I think, in the world today. Evelyn Araluen is one that I always recommend to people. Her book, Dropbear, if you can get your hands on that, it shows like the full spectrum of what poetry can do. And there's really beautiful family stories and stories of being on country to very, very powerful, strong, assertive critiques of colonialism and capitalism and all these things that are contributing to these crises, including the climate crisis. And that coming from an Indigenous perspective is something that is not fully understandable by non-Indigenous people, but is this like amazing worldview that you can kind of encounter. She's amazing. Elfie Shiosaki is a Noir poet from my part of the world as well, who writes really, really beautifully in a way that I think is accessible to anyone who can sit and see these family stories playing out alongside stories of country, of the environment. And I think it's just beautiful writing, full stop, both of her books, but also I think does kind of give the blueprint for some of the ways that anyone can be writing about these things. Alice Oswald is a very well-known British poet who does that accuracy, spontaneity and mystery thing as well as anyone I've ever encountered. Just has a turn of phrase that I would never have considered myself, and it just captures the feeling of being in water or being in a forest or being in front of a fire.
Thanks for listening to this quickie.
This episode was created by our superstar podcast team at TEDx London. Until next time,
Stay curious.